Hello and welcome to this recording on securing your Azure App Service using the Sophos XG Firewall. So a quick disclaimer, I won't be going in depth into the workings of Azure App Service or into other Azure services that we'll be using or demonstrating in this recording, or even the Sophos XG Firewall. So this is an how-to video on the steps that needs to be completed for this configuration to work. Configuration of securing your Azure App Service using the Sophos XG Firewall. And by Azure App Service, it could be any of the different services. So it could be a web app, it could be a mobile app, it could be an API app, it could even be Azure Functions. As long as you're hosting them in the environment of Azure App Service or being hosted by that underlying infrastructure, then you can secure them using the Sophos XG Firewall. So the main reason, or my main reason for making this video is because I've had requests about different people looking to do this. So that's the main reason why I'm making this video, and I really hope that this video will help you in accomplishing that task. So a quick review of what I will be doing today. So this is the environment that we'll be deploying at the end of this video. This is what we'll have deployed. We'll have a Sophos XG Firewall sitting in the security DMZ in Azure. So it doesn't have to be limited to one. I'm just using one for the purpose of this demonstration. You could have more than one. The XG Firewall supports HA mode. You can have multiple. You could have more than two, more than three, whatever number that you need to have to handle whatever load in your environment you can have. And that's best practice when it comes to architecture and design, especially when it comes to security architecture. I have the security DMZ in Azure where you have your security tools, and then you have your traffic flow through that, right? And then you can do all the necessary security checks, so the traffic flowing in or out of the environment. So that's what we'll be doing. So when it comes to the steps that I'll be following, and I'll put it in description below, these are the steps that I'll be following. So first thing that we'll do is I'll deploy the Sophos XG Firewall into the security subnets. Then we'll do the activation. We'll create a bit more subnets here. Then the next step is we'll deploy the management VM that has Visual Studio 2017, so which will be this management server here. And then we'll proceed to deploy our Azure App Service environment and an Azure web app that we'll be using for testing. And then we'll go ahead with the rest of the configuration for security. So just so you know, when it comes to Azure App Service, just quick background, quick overview. Azure App Service is this platform as a service. It's actually the most popular Azure platform as a service offering in Azure, right? And there are different flavors when it comes to deploying it. So you could deploy an Azure App Service, and by default, it would deploy a service into a shared multi-tenant environment, not something that isolated. That's the default. But Microsoft, recognizing that many organizations have requirements that's not suitable for, right? Maybe it could be legal requirement, it could be compliance requirement where you need to log maybe all traffic that's coming out or going into your network. So many organizations could have that form of requirement, in which case they have something more control, that they have more control, and not only that, something that they have more visibility into. And in which case you can take the Azure App Service and have that deployed within your isolated virtual network in Azure. So that's what we'll be doing. That's what's called the Azure App Service Environment, ASE. There are two versions. There's version 1, there's version 2. Version 2 is much more easier to deploy and manage compared with version 1. So probably best to go with version 2. So version 2 is what I will be demonstrating today. But just to give you that background of the angle that we are coming at this from. So let's just get into it because it's going to be a long one. And first thing that we'll do is we're going to deploy a Sophos XG Firewall into the Security Subnet in Azure. So in essence, what we'll be doing is we're going to be starting with this. We're going to deploy this. First of all, let's get into it. So I go to the Azure portal, I click on new, and I'll type in Sophos and I press enter here. And I select the Sophos XG Firewall and I click on create. just so as you can see, I'm doing everything essentially from scratch here, and there's a good reason for that. My reason for doing this is so that you can not only follow this, but also that you can trace your steps back. So let's say you've configured something and it's not working, you can look through all the steps that I've done today and be able to hopefully figure out where you've done something wrong. So for license type, I'll leave bring your own license. Virtual machine size, I'll select D2V2, good performance VM. For virtual network, I'll customize the name. I'll give it the name and I'll change the address space to 10.10/16 and I'll click OK to that. For subnet, I will customize the names of the subnet also according to what we have in a diagram. So a security front end, and I'll give that 10.10.254.0/24. And for the backend subnet, I'll call that security backend, and I'll give that a prefix of 10.10.253.0/24, and I'll click OK to that. For the public IP, I'll customize that a bit also. So from the name, or just reading the name, we should be able to tell what purpose that is for. So that's DO, which is the prefix that I'm using all through for this environment. So DO, Sophos XG01, PIP standing for public IP. So I'll make that static and I'll click OK to that. And then the domain name, I'll give it a unique domain name. And I'll also create a new storage account and give it something unique also. And I'll click OK to that. So that's me creating my Sophos XG firewall. Hopefully the validation passes and then we'll proceed with that. So validation passed, we click OK and deployment should start very soon. I'll go ahead and just click create here. So submitting deployment. Successful deployment in progress. So if I want to, I can click on this to monitor my deployment, and I'll pause the recording in a minute. But essentially what I've just done is this. So essentially what we have on the screen is what I've just done. So first XG firewall deployed into this vNet, which is 10.10/16 with two subnets. So the front-end subnet of the XG firewall NIC, which is the one interface connected to security front-end, which has that prefix, and the backend NIC connected to the security backend subnet, which has the prefix. So that's the first stage. After it's completed, I'll proceed to activate it. But for now, I'll pause this recording and I'll be back once the deployment completes. And welcome back. So the deployment completed successfully. So next thing I'll do is I'll go to my resource. If I go on the virtual machines, filter for the name of my Sophos XG firewall, I'll get the public IP address, because if I bring up the nodes, that's the next step. So we've deployed the firewall into the subnet and the vNet. Now we have to activate it. So because I'm using bring your own license. So this is something that I'll do off the screen. Let's connect that first. And let's log in with my credentials. So I'm logged into my credentials now. If you use pay as you go, you don't need to go through the step because activation is automatic. If you use pay as you go, you're paying per hour. So in this instance, I'll pause the recording, do my activation, and then I'll be back once the device is fully activated. So the activation completed now. As you can see, I'm logged into the web admin of the Sophos XG firewall. That's port 4444 of its public IP. You can see its LAN port, which is the backend. It's connected to the backend subnet, which is 10.10.253, and it has the IP address of .4. And on the WAN interface connected to the front-end security subnet, which is 10.10.254, and it has an IP of .4. So let's go ahead and put those labels in the diagram. So I'll put here 10.10.254.4, and for the backend, that's 10.10.253.4. Good. next step is we're going to create more subnets in the vNet. And by more subnet, what I mean is I'm going to create one more subnet called DO management subnet where I'll deploy my management server into. So let's go do that now. So to do that, I'll go back to my Azure portal. I'll go on the virtual networks and I'll filter again using my prefix, which is DHO. And what I'll do here is I'll go on the subnet under the virtual network and I'll add a new subnet. Give it the name of DO management subnet and I'll give it a prefix of 10.10.1/24 and I'll click OK to that. And that should be all ready. So that's fully deployed. So the next thing that I'll do now, having created the subnet, is I'll deploy my Windows Server 2016 management server into this subnet. And just so you know, what I'm going to be using this management server to do is going to function as a DNS. You see the reason for that down the road. But what it's also going to do is it's going to have Visual Studio installed because I will use it to deploy a web app to my test web app environment when that's ready. So let's go ahead and create that. So for that, I'll click on New here and I'll type Visual Studio rather than Windows 7. And what I'll do is I'll deploy a Windows 2016 server that has the latest version of Visual Studio 2017 Community Edition installed already. So I'll go ahead and select that image. Give it the name of DO Management Server 01. Specify my username. Azure doesn't like admin, so you have to use something apart from admin. I'll specify my password. Leave my subscription. I'll put everything I'll be deploying in this demonstration in a single resource group. Makes it easier to clean up after I'm done. So I'll click OK to that. For VM size, I'll just select D2SV3. That's a good size. And for the virtual network, here I have to ensure that my virtual network is selected, but the subnet, I don't want it to be deployed to the security front-end subnet, so I'll change the subnet to the DO management subnet. For public IP, I'll just make a bit of change in the name. I'll just add a P, so I know it's a public IP. And I'll leave that as dynamic. And for network security group, I'll leave the default. I'll disable monitoring because this is a test environment, so I'll need this for now, and I'll click OK to that. So hopefully validation passes, and I'll go ahead and click create. I'll pause the recording again, and I'll be back once it's completed. So after we're back, next thing that we're going to do is we're going to install DNS on DNS server role on that server. And the reason for that is the Azure App Service environment that we'll be deploying, we have to manage our own DNS, and this is what I'll be using. So I'll see you once it's fully deployed. So the deployment completed now. So what I can do is I can go to my resource, which is my Windows Management Server, get its public IP address and connect to it via HowDP. So I have my username and my password ready. So let's go for the user. And why that's coming up, because it may take a while, what I'll do. So the next thing I'll do is I'll install the DNS server role. Again, we'll touch on this later. I'll install DNS server role on this server. But at the same time, I'll set up Visual Studio. I'll log into Visual Studio with my email address and my account, and that will allow integration between Visual Studio and my Azure subscription. So let's go to do that now. So while Server Manager is coming up, I'll double click on Visual Studio to open it up. So I'll pause the recording again and I'll be back once both Server Manager and Visual Studio are up. So Server Manager is open now. So I can click on the Manage, Add Roles and Features, and I'll add DNS server role. Now I'm going to get an error, a warning message here saying that my server does not have a static IP address, but that's okay. I'm in Azure. We always get dynamically allocated addresses. So I'll click next to that. and I'll click install to begin to install the server. Now Visual Studio is open now. So what I'll do is, if it's the first time that you open in Visual Studio, it gives you the option to sign in with your account. So I'll click sign in, and what I'll do here is I'll sign in with my Microsoft account. That gives me that connection to my Azure subscription. And once I'm fully signed in and DNS server is fully installed on this machine, I'll be back. So I'll pause the recording now. See you in a minute. And I've fully connected Visual Studio with my Azure account. So if you've already opened Visual Studio before on whatever machine that you're using, of course, you have a sign in button here that you can use to sign into Visual Studio. But I opened it the first time, it prompted me to do that, so I did it then. So the next thing that we did was we also installed DNS Server. So as you can see, this is installed on this machine. So to round up this part, what I'll do is I'll get the IP address. Actually, what I need is command prompt. I'll bring up command prompt and I'll type in ipconfig. Gets the IP address of my management server, which is 10.10.1.4. So I'll add that to my diagram here. 10.10.1.4 is the IP address of my management server. So what I'll do is I'll configure this as the DNS for my virtual network. So I'll do that in Azure. So what I'll do, go to the Azure portal, go under my virtual network, which I'll go under virtual networks here, filter with my prefix of DO, get my virtual network and go under DNS service, specify custom, add my DNS server and save that. So that shouldn't take long. So it's saved now. So that's the DNS server for this virtual network. But for that to take effect on my management server, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and restart my management server. So I'll filter for it using my prefix of DO. And that's my DO management server 01. And I'll go ahead and restart that. So while it's restarting, let's move ahead to number 3. So now we move ahead to the next step. So we've done created a security subnet, front end and back end, and we've activated it. We've also created a management server. We have Visual Studio and DNS installed on it, and we've configured this as the DNS server for the vNet. So now we go to create our ASE subnet, our app service environment subnet, and we'll deploy an ASE, an app service environment that we can then deploy our Azure app service into. So as mentioned, the app service that we deploy into it, it doesn't have to be a web app, but web app is very popular. So it could be web app, it could be mobile app, it could be API app, it could even be Azure Functions. So what I'll do here is I'll go over to my Azure portal and I'll go under app services. So one thing to watch out for when we're talking about Azure app services is that there are different ways to create it. And when you especially want to create the kind of environment that I'm describing, which is you have an internal app service environment which deploys an Azure Platform as a Service app service into your isolated virtual network, you have to use a certain method. So you can use an Azure Ham template to create it, or the other method would be to create the app service environment first, the internal app service environment first, and then create your web app afterwards. If you go for the method of you're going to just create your web app and you go to create app service and you go to select your web app or any other app and then you go to create it and you use this method, you won't be able to create an internal, or at least for now, an internal app service environment. So if I go to create new here, it allows me to, so for example, I can select my isolated plan, but it's not going to allow me to. This is just going to create an external environment for me. So what I want is an internal one. So what I'll do is I'll go back here on the app services. I'll create app service. And first thing I'll do is I'll create my app service environment first, my internal app service environment. Let's click on create for that. So I'll call this DO ASE. DO being my prefix, ASE being app service environment. You can see that by default it's specified .p.azurewebsites.net. If you're familiar with Azure Web Apps, you realize that if you create just one that hosted in the multi-tenant environment, you have .azurewebsites.net, but now you have .p because you're creating an app service environment. But this is not even where we're going because we're creating an internal one. But I just want you to make note of that. For resource group, I'll go ahead and use an existing resource group and select my same resource group. Is DO Azure G. For virtual network, here I'll change this and I'll select my virtual network from here, which will be DO Azure vNet. So one thing is your virtual network and the app service environment must be in the same resource group. So that's a requirement. I'll click on subnet. So you may be wondering, why didn't I pre-create my subnet the same way I did when I was going to create the management server? I created the subnet first and then I deployed the management server into it. The reason is because that's not yet supported using this method that I'm using. So which is why the subnet is going to be created as part of this deployment process of the Azure App Service environment. So let's create the subnet here. So I'll create the subnet, and if I have more than one prefix in my virtual network, I can select the prefix to use, and I can specify the subnet address block, which is 10.10.5.0/24 that I want to use in this case. So if I go back to the diagram, that's what we have, 10.10.5.0/24. So that's what we're doing. And I'll click OK to that. So here, there are two types of app service environment, external or internal. Whichever one you select determines the level again of flexibility and control that you can have. External means it's going to be reachable from the internet. It's going to deploy this app service environment. Even though it's in your isolated network, it's going to have a public IP address that makes it reachable from the internet. You may have less security controls when it comes to that. Also, it may not be suitable if your goal is to be able to host an internal application or a business application that you only use within your organization. If you want to host that, but you want the flexibility and the agility and the scalability and all the features like deployment slots that you get with Azure App Service, but it's an internal application, it's not an external application, this is not suitable for you, which is what we want. So in this case, I'll change this from external to internal. And once I change it to internal, you see it's going to specify that I should have a domain. One thing to mention about this domain here is that ensure that this is a unique domain. So the reason I say this is this domain cannot conflict. If you're going to be using a custom domain, later for your Azure web app that you're going to be deploying, so maybe you want to publish it out to the internet and you're going to be using a custom domain, it cannot conflict with whatever domain you select here. So you have to be careful with the selection, which is why it's advisable to use something like internal hyphen your normal domain name. So if your domain name were to be david.com, so just use internal hyphen david.com or whatever that you want to use. In my own case, what I'm going to be using is my domain is dokayode.xyz. So that's dokayode.xyz. And let's go back to type this in properly. Okay, but one thing that I want to mention is if I were to use my normal domain here, and then I want to create a custom domain to publish my app as www.dokayode.xyz, I won't be able to because I've already used this here. So which is why I'll specify something like ASE hyphen my normal domain name so that there's no conflict later on. Just make a note of that. So having selected that, you can see that now the .p.azure website and .net has already disappeared because there's internal. And internal ASE, just to give a bit more explanation to that, what it means is it's going to deploy an internal load balancer. So an internal load balancer is what it's going to deploy to the front end here. And this will be the endpoint that is going to be distributing traffic to the instances that are hosting your web app. So that will be the endpoint, this internal load balancer. And this internal load balancer, we have an IP address from within the range for your subnet that the ASE is being hosted in. So that's why it's called internal, because it's going to have an internal load balancer with an internal IP, not an external IP. And that makes it suitable to host internal apps or business apps. So I'll go ahead and just click create to that. So you know this is a long process. It's going to take a while to create. So if you want, you can monitor your deployment here. One thing I want to point out, if I click refresh on this, is that I realize that as part of my creation of the app service environment, I'm creating the subnet. But it's not only going to create the subnet. You can see that it's creating a route table, and it's also creating a network security group as part of this process. So the four things that it's creating the subnet, it's going to create the route table. It's not going to associate the route table to the subnet. We'll see why down the road. And it's going to create a network security group. Again, it's not going to associate it with the subnet, but it's going to create these or pre-create these to make them available to use if you want to use down the road. But just make a note of that in case you finish your deployment and you wonder, where is this NSG coming from or this route table? It's all created as part of the process. So what I'll do again is I'll pause the recording. It's going to take a while. Get ready for a long wait. And then once it's all fully done, I'll be back. See you in a few minutes. Hello, so welcome back. That took a while to complete, by the way. And also for your information, so it was taking a really long time. So I think it took about 30 minutes before, and it still did not complete. It still did not complete. So what I did was cancel the deployment and then redeployed the template. So it's all completed now. So we have our Azure App Service environment. So if I close this and I click this browse button here, I can search App Service environment. Should come up. And here we go. I have my app service environment here. So what this is going to lead us to, if I bring up the diagram, is now we have a app service environment. But the very first thing that we need to do after creating a app service environment is we need to do some configuration, especially when it comes to the certificates of the app service environment. To give you a brief understanding of what we're actually doing, I'll bring up another whiteboard here. So what we have is we have Azure vNet, right? So let's say this is Azure vNet. And within Azure vNet, as part of the creation of a app service environment, we created a subnet. So now we have a dedicated subnet here within our vNet, which I'll label subnet, ASE subnet. Within this ASE subnet, what we've just done is we've deployed an environment called the App Service Environment, the ASE itself. Within this ASE, it's where we're going to be deploy our Azure App Service Plan, which if you're familiar with Azure App Services, that's essentially your bunch of web server farm, App Service Plan. And this is where we'll be deploying things like our mobile, our web apps, or our mobile apps, or API apps or functions, Azure Functions also. So this is where we're going to be deploying it, but I hope you are able to make some sense out of this, right? So we've got the ASE subnet, we have our app service environment. So, but for this app service environment, remember, because it's internal, what we essentially have is we have this Azure internal load balancer here, right? Which has an IP address within from the range within the subnet. And if I go back to the app service environment on the Azure portal, if I go on the properties here, I should be able to see virtual IP address. So this virtual IP address that we're seeing here, that's the virtual IP address of this internal load balancer here. So that's what that address is. So that's the virtual IP address of this internal load balancer here. And the other thing that we need to do is we need to configure a certificate that this is going to use if we're going to be using HTTPS. Now, when we created our ASE, it asked for a domain name. I put in my domain name as the ASE in front, ASE hyphen the okode.xyz. So the certificate I'm going to be uploading for this, which is the ILB certificate, has to do this. It's going to be a wildcard certificate for the domain that I've specified, which is star ASC -d okode.xyz, but also for star.scm dot ase -d okode.xyz. And for those of you again that are familiar with Azure App Service, which is the assumption for people that are looking to do this, is SCM is the URI that points to the backend KUDU project KUDU console, which provides a lot of the functionalities that Azure App Services offer. So things like integration with GitHub and other functionalities like that, they are all powered by this open source project KUDU. And you can find the project itself on GitHub. So that's the URI for it for whatever web application that you have. So that's what we're going to do now. So if I go back to the list of instructions, so now we've created the ASE, we have to configure this ILB certificate. So there are two ways. The best way, of course, is because if you go out to a third-party certificate authority, you get a valid certificate that you can use. You avoid all the certificate prompts and stuff, right? But in this case, I'm not going to be putting my resources to doing that. So what I've instead done is I've just used a self-signed certificate, and you can see that using PowerShell, new self-signed certificate, and the DNS name is ascd.okode.xyz, scm.dokode.xyz. The thing to point out here is that this script, it's available online. So if I do control to make it much larger for you to see. So the script is available for free online. But again, if you're something that you're not very you're not sure where to get this, just put a comment down below. I'll be happy to provide you a link, maybe upload it to my GitHub account, and then you can download from there. But that's what I'm going to be using. It's which I've already run the script, and then I'm going to be using this self-signed certificate in this case. So let's go to do that. So actually, if I go back to the Azure portal, if I go back on the overview, it's going to start warning me instantly to say, hey, you need to configure this certificate. And I can either click on this link or I can go on the ILB certificate here. So if I click on the ILB certificate, you can see essentially what I explained now to you to say, listen, this must have the wildcard for the domain name that you specified and scm.the domain name that you specified, which is for the KUDU site. So what I'll do is I'll just click on update ILB certificate here. I'll go ahead and select my certificate and I'll put in the password that I used to protect the self-signed certificate. There. Of course, it's going to be a PFX file that includes both the certificate and the private key. So I'll go ahead and click upload to that. And it should take a while and then it should be completed. And I should see the certificates display here shortly. So let's go. Yeah, and there we go. And you can see the certificate all uploaded and all displayed there. So we're going to move a step further because now we have a app service environment all set up. The next thing that we're going to do is I'm going to configure DNS. So the reason why we're going to do this is remember that we installed the DNS server for this. Now this domain is called dokode.xyz. Sorry, I keep saying that asc-d okode.xyz. But the thing to mention is my internal systems, even if they are connecting via hybrid connection through my Sophos XG firewall, maybe from a remote site, they are not aware of what this domain is. They have no awareness of that. So I need to host that on a DNS server that they're going to be pointing to in one way. So which is why I installed DNS on this management server originally. So what I'll go to this management server to do is I'll go to configure a new zone for this. And what that zone is going to be pointing to is it's going to be pointing to the IP address or the virtual IP of the internal load balancer, because that will be the endpoint for all the instances that the Azure App Service will use to host my web app. So let's go to do that now. So if I go on the virtual machines, let me connect back to my management server and get my public IP address. So let's go overview, get my public IP, bring up remote desktop and connect to it. So here we go. So again, I need the KUDU.xyz to point to the internal load balancer. So I'll go on the tools, I'll bring up DNS, and on the DNS I'll expand forward lookup zone and I'll create a new zone. Primary zone, I will just use the default here, and that'll be for that zone. I'll click next, next, and finish. And what I'll do is I'll create a new A record star, and the IP address will be the IP address, remember, of the internal load balancer here, and that was created, which is 10.10.5.11. If you remember when we saw that earlier, if I go on my app service environment, and if I go for the virtual IP, you'll see the IP there again. So that on the properties, I can get my virtual IP from here. And that's what I'll configure that to point to 10.10.5.11. So let's go ahead and put that in here. And I'll go ahead and click add host, finish, done. Right. So that's all done now. So the next thing that I'm going to be doing in this case is I'll go to now deploy my web app within a service plan. Remember the diagram that we had earlier, that's within this app service environment. So again, I'm going to be deploying my web app now, which is this one. But as part of the deployment for this web app, I'm going to deploy an app service plan as part of that deployment. So let's go ahead and do that. That shouldn't take too long to complete. So what I'll do is I'll go under app services, and you can see I have no current app service. I'll create a new app service and I'll create a new web app. And if I click on create, and it's pointing to that, I use an existing resource group, keep everything all in the same resource group, easier for tidy up at the end. So one thing is when you're creating a web app, again, it's under the assumption I'm using this multi-tenant environment, but also I want to point out to you here is there are two OS flavors, Windows and Linux. In Azure, you can either have something that's called an Azure App Service or something called App Service for Containers. If you select App Service for Containers, that's essentially talking about this one, which is the Linux option. But in this case, I'm going to be using that for Windows. And as at the time of this recording, which is 1st January 2018, App Service for Containers, which is the Linux flavor, is not supported for deployment within an app service environment. I'm sure Microsoft are already working on that, and I'm sure that we'll have that at some point. So I'll leave that as Windows because that's the only option supported for now for an internal app service environment. So I click on app service plan and I make a change to this. By default, it's going to create a random plan for me. That's not what I want. Instead, I'm going to create a new one and I'll give it the name that I want. So let's go through this process. So give that a name, DOASE. So here's where we get to select, because now after specifying the name of my app service plan, it says, so this app service plan, which location are you going to be deploying it? If I select any of these other regions, that's the multi-tenant environment. But because I already have this app service environment that's within one of my virtual networks that's in West Europe, I have the option to select that to say, hey, I want this powerful multi-featured service by Microsoft, but I want it within my virtual network. That's the power, right? That's the power of the app service environment. So I select that. By default, it's going to select this level 1 isolated Python tier for me. You can change it to something else if you want to, but for the sake of this demonstration, I'll leave that. I'll click on select. I'll click OK to that. So one thing to mention is once that's changed, it's going to change the name of my web app to the internal domain that I specified when I configured it, as you can see here. So I can enable application insight if I want to, which I won't for now because it's just a simple test. And I'll go ahead and create this web app. So it shouldn't take too long to do. So let's go back to the steps of what we're doing, because we're deploying the web app into the app service environment. Again, it could be mobile or API app. And I've already configured DNS, so that's all good. So what we're going to do is essentially wait for our web app deployment to complete, and once it's successfully completed, we should be able to open up a browser and browse to our web app and see what that looks like. And then I'm going to show you how to deploy to that. Before I go ahead and pause the recording, I'll do two quick things. So I'll go on the local server, because I'm on the server, and I'll disable IE and non-security, just because it's a test environment. It's not generally a good idea on a server to be browsing on a server, but it's just testing stuff. And I'll bring up my browser. At the same time, I'll also open Visual Studio. So, and then I'll pause this recording and wait for, oh, actually, here's the thing. My resource already completed deployment, so that was really quick. So now what I have is I have an Azure app, web app that's within my app service environment, and I can get the URL for the web app. And because we have configured DNS properly, and we've set our vNet to use the DNS that we've configured, and we've created the right zones that we need to create, we should be able to get to this. If you've not configured DNS properly, this part will probably fail, but because I've configured DNS properly, I should be able to. So because it's, again, self-signed certificate, I'll just go ahead and click continue to this website. And in a few seconds, and here we go, your app service app is up and running. And if you think about this, this could be an internal application, it could be a business application. I have all those advantages, all those features of the Azure App Service. I have those available to me. Plus, I'm not managing the infrastructure. I'm not responsible for managing the infrastructure. I can easily scale. It's really agile environment. I have this integration. If I have a CI, continuous integration, continuous deployment pipeline, I could integrate with this. It's got integration with Git, with VSDS. So it had all this power behind it without managing the infrastructure. But this is running within my virtual network, and this could be running my business application. So this is really cool. I don't know about you, but this is really cool. So I have that up and running now. Well, next thing I'll do is this is not like something that's really demonstrative. So, but let's say this is an internal app. My developers can start deploying apps to this. So I can go ahead and create a new project. For example, let's create a quick deployment. So create a new Visual Studio project. So my developers have this URL. They can start deploying whatever business application or internal application that we're using to it. So I'll just create a sample ASP.NET web application. I'll give the web application name or the project a name, sorry, and I'll click OK to that. and I'll just select an MVC project. I'll set that, leave that set to no authentication. I'll click OK to that. And once it's fully loaded, what I'll do is I'll edit some files and I'll publish this web app straight into my app service environment. Why it's doing this, I'll just quickly show you something else. So I talked about the project KUDU earlier. So to be able to get to the URL for that, that's just adding SEM to this, which I'll copy, and I won't make any change to this. I'll just open that in a new tab. So let's go to a new tab, and that's sem.do, yes, a web app. So I've got SEM in front of the web app name. So if you're familiar with the multi-tenant Azure App Service, you go over here, you press enter. What's going to happen is you're going to instantly, because you're already signed into the app service, it's going to automatically sign you into this project KUDU console. It's not the same in this app service environment, right? If I go ahead and press enter, it's going to prompt me to put in a username and password. That's what it's going to do. There's no single sign on here. So do I have that right? Maybe I've got something wrong. Nodes. Let's go and I'll put. So actually, let's go back to my app over here. And it is SCM. Oh, sorry, my bad. So it's not SCM in front, sorry, it's SCM at the back. So that's my bad. So I'll put .scm. So that's my web app name .scm my domain name, and I press enter to that, and I continue to the website. And what's going to happen is it's going to prompt me to put in a username and password, which is different from the experience that you get again if you just use the multi-tenant environment. So which username and password am I going to put in here? For that, if I go under my web app, I have to set a deployment credential. And that's what we're going to use. So I have one set to DO Azure admin. I'll leave that. I'll just set a new password here and I'll save that. And once that all finished setting, I'll go ahead and use these credentials to log into the project KUDU site. So that's all successfully set. Let's go back and I put in DO Azure admin and I press OK to that. And everything should be good now. So here we are. I'm logged into the project KUDU console and I can start using all those powerful tools that are available to me from this console. So some really powerful stuff. So here I am. I'm getting command line access to the backend instances. There's a lot of cool stuff that, I mean, there's a whole lot of, can do a whole course just on looking at the power of the things that you can do from this console. But just so you know, that's how you log in when you're in this environment. So let's go back to my Visual Studio project. So what I'll do is let me go on the views on the home and on the index.cshtml. Let's make some changes and I'll publish this. And then we'll probably pause this recording and then move over to a second part because this video is getting longer. So I'll just make some changes to this. I'll say Visual Studio to ASE version 1. Maybe make this H2 rather than, yeah, and H1, save it, and then I can right click and publish this. Now, because I've already linked Visual Studio with my Azure subscription, I can just select Microsoft Azure App Service. Rather than select create new, which we try to create a new web app, I'll just select existing and I'll click on publish. So because I have that integration going, it's going to look into my Azure subscription and show me what I have available, which is detected my web app. If I had deployment slot under my web app, I can deploy directly to those deployment slot, but I'll just select the web app because that's what I have for now. That's the production deployment slot, and I'll click OK to that. So at some point, it's going to prompt because it's going to try to use web deploy, which is going to try to use HTTPS. But because my certificate is self-signed, it's going to prompt me and say, you're using a certificate that we don't actually trust. Yep, and there we go. It's going to ask me to accept the prompt. I'll just go ahead and accept the prompt for this environment. And publishing failed, it says. So this is the first time. So what I'll probably, let's see, could not connect to remote SVC. Let's do that again. Let's do publish. So let me go find what the issue is with this one, and then once I found what the issue is, I'll resume the video, and then we can continue with the rest of the process. Just so you know, so there wasn't really anything wrong in terms of configuration. That was just for some reason there was a scale out event that happened with the app service plan itself. So I'm not sure why that happened. And this is not a place to really dig into that. But there was a scale out event that occurred and that caused the whole site to be down for a while. But they're all back now. So if I go ahead and do the publishing again, I think everything should be okay. So as you can see, it says the infrastructure to all this application is starting now will be up momentarily. That was what happened. And then after a while, everything came back. So since everything is back now, I can go back to just click on publish and you should be able to get to the site and everything it's all published now. So if I go back to my site, which I have here, I can do a refresh on that. And as you can see, I'm all logged up. I've just deployed from Visual Studio straight to Azure Platform as a Service, just internally here. And this is something that your developers will probably appreciate. So having done this, I think what we'll do is we'll stop this video here because we've gone for quite a while. And at the end, what we have here is we have the entire environment that we've just described there. But what we'll proceed to do in the next part is to configure the security because we still have this environment, but remember that access to it is still not like really secure. But I'll just in the next video or in the next part, what I'll do is I'll proceed to make this app externally available and also configure security as part of that. So thanks very much for watching this video. I hope you got something useful from it. Then I'll see you in the next recording. See you.